Today's lesson is on the Protestant Reformation and the reaction to the Protestant Reformation. So the goal of this lesson is to understand the origin and reaction to the Protestant Reformation, and also to understand what was the Protestant Reformation. We're going to have two new vocabulary words that you'll definitely want to remember the meaning of, and that is indulgences and the term Reformation. So the Renaissance means an awakening or a rebirth. So why is this Renaissance different than the Middle Ages? Well, you've already learned this week about different reasons why the Renaissance is different from the Middle Ages. One area we haven't talked much about is the change within the Catholic Church. So, what do we know about power of the Catholic Church? We know that the head of the Catholic Church is the Pope. However, in the Renaissance, the power shifts. So in the Middle Ages, we talked a lot about how powerful the Catholic Church was, even more powerful in some cases than kings. We're going to see this whole dynamic change, and we're going to learn today why. Well, there were some clues leading up to this whole Reformation that the Catholic Church was weakening. And the first clue we had is the Great Schism of 1054. And a schism is a really fancy word for crack. And so if we look at this map, we can see that there was a crack in terms of religion. So before 1054, you have one type of Christianity that was the same throughout all this colored area here on the map. But in 1054, we see that the church is going to fracture. And so everything on the western side of the map is going to be under the Roman Catholic Church, and everything on this side of the map, on the eastern side, is going to be a different type of Christianity called Eastern Orthodox. So instead of having one Christianity, in 1054, we have two. So if you think about it in this way, the Pope is losing half of his power in 1054. There's going to be a second Great Schism. And this second Great Schism happens between 1378 and 1417. So this second schism shows us that the church is again weakening. It's again losing some of its power. It's going to fracture more. And so we have half of Europe here in purple, loyal to a pope who sets up his court at Avignon. We have this yellow part of Europe, loyal to a pope who is set up here in Rome. So Europe's going to divide between two popes, two types of Catholicism. After 1417, we'll see Europe start to come together again under one pope in Rome. But the point of this being these two great schisms is that the Catholic Church is starting to weaken. Instead of being the almighty, all-powerful in Europe, it's now starting to show some cracks. And what are some problems? Well, we talked about the Great Schism in that we have two popes. We have a pope in France, we have a pope in Rome. And so this is going to cause a lot of distrust against the church. What is the church doing? Is the church really just trying to become all-powerful? Is it really not about this Christian religion? And so people start to criticize the church. They start to question some of the church practices, including indulgences, which we're going to get into a little bit more deeply in a moment. But what is an indulgence? It's basically paying a fee or paying money for forgiveness of sins and a guarantee that you can get into heaven. So you could have committed many crimes. However, if you pay an indulgence to the church, you can kind of get away scot-free. You get to still go to heaven even if you've done things that are bad. And so the church would send priests all throughout Europe who would collect money from people to pay these indulgences to get their free trip into heaven. Then they would take that money from the indulgences and they would spend it to adorn churches with golden crosses and jewels, or to build beautiful cathedrals. People were also forced to pay taxes, and that money was sent to Rome. And then finally, the Spanish Inquisition, which we know because we learned about it, is the Spanish questioning people who are accused of heresy or speaking out against the church. And so this is all going to lead to people wanting to confront the church, to tell the church, hey, you're not really doing the right thing. And so we have a man named Martin Luther who's going to confront the church. He's going to want to reform the church. And so he's going to come up with 95 criticisms of the church, these 95 complaints of things he thinks that the church is doing wrong. He's going to nail them to the doors of his church, and he is going to kick off a whole reformation or change to the Catholic Church by doing so. So let's take a look a little more deeply about what happened. So who was Martin Luther? He was German. He lived in a place called Wittenberg, Germany. He was born in 1483, and growing up, he got caught in a terrible thunderstorm, and he was very nearly struck by lightning. And Luther said, if I survive this, I will dedicate my life to the church. And so he did. He became a monk. Now, the time Martin Luther lived in Germany, in this Holy Roman Empire, there was very uneven prosperity. There was a lot of really poor people and a few people who held all of the wealth. Also, at this time, there were new universities popping up all over Europe. And these ideas of the humanists that you learned about earlier this week, who come from Northern Europe, so those ideas start to spread. And what helps them spread? Well, you learned about that too, the printing press. And so the printing press is a really big invention because now people can spread these ideas. And Martin Luther reads the ideas of these humanists, and they start to make his brain work. He starts to think even more extremely about what the Catholic Church was doing and how against it he was, because he felt that the Catholic Church was really corrupt. So Martin Luther in 1510 actually went to Rome. He visited Rome, and he was shocked by the things he saw. He couldn't believe how corrupt he believed that the church was. And one of the main things Luther was against was the selling of indulgences. And what is an indulgence? Well, here's your vocabulary term that you're going to want to make sure you record. An indulgence is a kind of cancellation of punishment for sin. So did you steal from your neighbor? Don't worry about it. If you have enough money to pay an indulgence, you'll be forgiven. Did you beat up the kid down the street? Hey, it's fine. If you can pay an indulgence, you can be forgiven. Luther doesn't believe this goes along with actual church teachings. In fact, there are a few major things that Luther has problems with. The first is that he believes that the clergy is corrupt. So the people who are preaching and telling you how to live, he believes actually are not living by those same guidelines. Priests who are working with the people were poorly trained. They didn't really know what Luther felt they should know. Luther believed that popes and priests were too involved in politics, and we saw a lot of that in the Middle Ages, didn't we? About how popes got involved in politics, how they had arguments with kings, and Luther felt that this was also inappropriate. Going along with that, church officials seemed too involved in secular matters. So Luther didn't understand why church officials were involved in secular matters, meaning things that didn't have to do with the church or things that were outside of the church. Luther also had a problem with the fact that church leaders rose to power through wealth or politics, meaning it wasn't a meritocracy. You didn't become a cardinal or a bishop because you were the best person for the job. You got to become a pope or a bishop or a cardinal because you were wealthy or because your family was strong politically. So you didn't have the best people in the best roles. And another thing Luther had a big problem with is that the church taxed its members to finance churches and lives of luxury. So to be a part of the church, you had to pay a tax, and that tax money would then be taken and it would be used to build these big, beautiful cathedrals, or it would go directly to people involved in the church. And those people, like these popes and these cardinals and these bishops, lived these lives of ultimate luxury, which Luther didn't think went along with church teachings. And so these 6 things really sat in Luther's mind, and they germinated, they grew, and Luther eventually put them all together in 95 theses or 95 complaints against the church. By writing these down, Luther said, "I am hot-blooded by temperament, and my pen gets irritated easily." So he's telling us, I was really irritated. I was really upset when I wrote these 95 complaints down. He felt that the things that the church were doing didn't really go along with Christianity. They didn't go along with the church teachings or what he felt they should be. In fact, he said the church should be for every Christian. And he said every true Christian, whether living or dead, has part in all the blessings of Christ. And this is granted by God, even without letters of pardon. So you shouldn't be forgiven. You shouldn't get away with things just because you're really wealthy. So these 95 complaints Luther puts together. He carries them to the church in his town of Wittenberg, and he nails them to the door. Because Luther is living in the time that he lives in, people are able to read these. These 95 theses are copied. They're sent all throughout Europe. And so here in this area of Germany that Luther lives, we begin a Reformation, or look at the word Reformation, reforming of the church. So we can say that this Reformation begins in Northern Europe. And what is a Reformation? Well, here's your other important term you want to make sure that you record. A Reformation is a religious movement that began in the 1500s to reform the Catholic Church. So the whole point of this is not to break away from the Catholic Church. These people, like Martin Luther and the other men we'll talk about shortly, didn't want to get rid of the Catholic Church. They didn't want to make something new. They wanted to protest and reform. They wanted the Catholic Church to reform. And we're going to see that this Reformation, called the Protestant Reformation, begins in Northern Europe. And here we have an image of Luther himself preaching his ideas. Now, Luther's ideas begin in Wittenberg, Germany. This is where Lutheranism begins. So let's look at our words again. We're talking about Martin Luther. Lutheranism are Luther's ideas. Okay, so Luther's ideas take root. The Catholic Church says to Luther, we are not going to change. In fact, Luther himself is in physical danger. He has to hide. He can't live out in the open because the Catholic Church has a bounty on his head. But nevertheless, these ideas, these Lutheran ideas, take hold and they spread. And we can look at this map and see how after Luther's ideas really start to take hold and spread throughout Europe, we have a whole lot of these Protestant, remember, protesting and reforming types of religions take hold. And some examples are Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglican or the Church of England. So let's look at some people who took Luther's ideas and changed them to fit their own beliefs and kicked off other new religions. The first is John Calvin. John Calvin starts this idea of Calvinism, named after himself. And this idea of Calvinism is begun in 1536. Now, Calvinism also goes along with some of Luther's ideas, which include things like you don't need wealth. You should be able to speak directly to God without a priest being involved. But he also had other beliefs like the idea of predestination. And Calvin's idea of predestination is the idea that God had long ago determined who would go to heaven. It doesn't matter what happens in your life. God already knows whether or not you're going to heaven. But because you don't know, you better live a really good life just in case. So predestination, it's the idea that God determined who would go to heaven. Now, some people really believed in Calvin's ideas. In fact, in Switzerland, they called on Calvin and they said, Calvin, please come here and help us create a new type of society. And so Calvin moves to Switzerland and he begins a theocracy. And the theocracy is a government ruled by religious leaders. So the idea of a theocracy, the idea of predestination, go along with John Calvin. In this area in Switzerland that Calvin spread his ideas, he aimed to create what he called a city of God. So Calvin said, you really need to work hard. You need to be honest. You need to be moral, meaning a good person. He imposed strict laws on behavior. So you were told in the city of God in Switzerland that Calvin creates that you had to behave in specific ways. Another thing that Calvin does is he sets up schools for children. And so unlike in the Middle Ages, we start to see education, learning, and literacy spread. So at this point, we're going to have three major Christian religions. We have Catholicism, we have Lutheranism, and we have Calvinism. And each of them have different ideas about salvation. Catholics believe that it's achieved through faith and good work. Lutherans of Martin Luther believed it's achieved through faith alone, and Calvinists believe it's already predetermined. The Catholics have 7 sacraments that all are tenets or basic parts of their religion. The Lutherans believe in some of these sacraments, but reject others because they believe that you should connect directly with God. Only God can get rid of your sin. And the same for Calvinists. In Catholicism, the head of the church is the Pope. The Lutherans elect councils, and Calvins have a council of elders, so people with experience. The importance of the Christian Bible for Catholics are that the Bible and the church are sources of truth. Lutherans reject the church in that nature and say the Bible alone is the source of truth, along with Calvinism. So we see some agreement here. How belief is revealed? Well, according to Catholics, you need priests for that to happen. So the priests will interpret the Bible and church teachings for people. Lutherans say no, people should be able to interpret the Bible for themselves, and so do Calvinists. And this is important too because prior to this, Catholic masses and the Bible were all written in Latin. So even if you were literate and you could read, if you didn't know Latin, you couldn't read. Protestant religions translate the Bible into the vernacular or the language that the people spoke so that they would be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. So we have some major differences between Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism, but we can see some things that are sort of the same between these two. Now, the Reformation doesn't just take place in Northern Europe. It spreads as well. So if we look at the Reformation in places like England and Scotland, which we have here in the map, we have England and Scotland, we can see some Reformation happening not necessarily for religious reasons, but maybe for some more personal reasons. So at this time, the King of England was a man named Henry VIII, who had a really big problem. He did not have an heir. He had been married for a number of years and only had a daughter. So he wanted to annul his marriage, meaning make his marriage not legal so that he could marry someone else. But the Pope rejected that and said, no, that's not something you could do. Now, Henry VIII had been a really strongly Catholic king. In fact, he had written about Catholicism and against the Protestant Reformation and was called a defender of the faith by the Pope. However, when the Pope said, nope, Henry, you're not going to get your own way. You can't get a divorce so you could marry some other woman. Henry had had enough with the Catholic Church. He broke with the church and said, I'm going to make my own church then. And so he formed what's called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And the head of this new Church of England that Henry formed is led by the monarch, meaning at that point, by starting his own type of Christianity, Henry could divorce his first wife and marry his second wife. We're going to learn a little bit more about Henry VIII and how unlucky he was in life and marriage later on this week. So we see England being influenced by Luther and Calvin, not by the English accepting their beliefs, but by the English saying, hey, we can start our own religion too. Now in Scotland, there was a reformer named John Knox. And John Knox was a preacher who had read John Calvin's ideas and identified with them. He said these are really, really great ideas, and he spread those ideas and formed his own church called the Presbyterian Church. And so in Scotland, we have a new type of religion being formed, which is based on Calvinism. So we can see it here on the map in this blue-green color as Calvinist. And Presbyterians are influenced by the teachings of Calvin. So now we have even more Protestant types of Christianity coming about. So this Reformation is a big deal. It made a lot of changes. And what were those impacts? Well, one impact is that rulers grew stronger. And so what does this mean? It means the church is losing power. The wars of religion within the church weakens the church, and we see things coming that give the rulers right to choose a country's religion. And this is a turning point in European life. We are not going to have questions anymore about who's more powerful, the king or the pope, because the answer is going to be the king. The rulers of the countries are the most powerful. We start to see experiments in self-government. So what does this mean? Well, these Protestant countries start to move towards self-government, and we see this idea of federalism being developed, meaning that a government is shared between national and local levels, which is what we have here in the United States. So we can thank the Protestant Reformation for some of our basic ideas. We see economic and social effects. We see free market capitalism, which is the type of economy we have today. We see Calvin's idea of hard work having economic impacts. So the economies of countries grow. We start to see wealth. And we have greater access to education, meaning more people could read. That means knowledge can be shared more quickly, more easily. You're going to see an explosion of ideas. And then finally, this has an impact on women. Protestant churches allowed clergy to marry. So in the Catholic Church, priests and bishops and cardinals were not allowed to marry. Protestant religions allowed people to marry. Even Luther himself was married to an ex-nun. Women could become church leaders, so women had a role in church. And Protestant religion said that in the eyes of God, women and men were seen as equal. So we see quite a few impacts among many coming out of the Protestant Reformation. But let's look at what this really means to us. And this is the last thing we're going to look at. Prior to the Reformation, we have Christianity. And this Christianity in the Middle Ages was Catholicism. So if you lived in the Middle Ages before 1054 in that first Great Schism, you were a Catholic. You were either a Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. However, this was your options before 1054. After Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany in 1519, we have all types of Christianity because now we have Protestant religion, and there are a lot of them, but just a few. We have Episcopalians, we have Baptists, we have Presbyterians, Mormons, Methodists, Lutherans. So you have all these different types of Christianity today, and we can even add more and more and more on here. So how does this Protestant Reformation impact our life today? It does it in a huge way, because if you drive down the street, you're going to see tons and tons of Christian churches, but we have a lot of different ideas included. I hope this was informational. Please let your teacher know if you have any questions.